Picture this. You're sitting in your New Orleans home on a humid March evening in 1919, windows cracked open to catch whatever breeze might drift through the French Quarter. Jazz music floats from neighboring houses, but tonight, that familiar soundtrack carries an edge of desperation. Because everyone in the Crescent City knows about the letter, the warning. Play jazz music or prepare to meet your maker. Welcome to the most bizarre chapter in American criminal history, where a serial killer didn't just hunt victims, he held an entire city hostage with nothing more than a pen, some newspaper ink, and the promise that music might save your life. But before we dive into letters and jazz ultimatums, we need to understand what New Orleans was experiencing in the months leading up to that infamous correspondence. This wasn't some random burst of violence. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror that had been building for over a year. The first confirmed attack came on May 23, 1918. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Italian grocers living behind their shop on Upper Line Street. Someone had chiseled out a panel in their back door. Not kicked it in, not forced a window, but methodically removed wood to create an entry point. Inside, both victims were found with their throats slashed and skulls crushed by an axe. The weapon? Left behind at the scene, as if the killer wanted to sign his work. But here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply unsettling. The axe didn't belong to the killer. It was the Maggio's own tool, taken from their shed and used against them. This detail would become the calling card of what newspapers would eventually dub the Axeman of New Orleans. The methodical nature of these attacks revealed something crucial about our mysterious perpetrator. This wasn't crime of passion or desperation. Someone was taking time to study their victims, learn their routines, identify their tools, and plan entries that left minimal evidence. We're dealing with what modern criminal psychologists would recognize as an organized killer. Someone who brought patience and calculation to their gruesome work. What happened next would establish a pattern so disturbing that it defied everything investigators thought they knew about serial killers. Over the following months, attacks began accumulating with disturbing regularity. June brought another Italian family under assault. Louis Basuma and his partner Harriet Lowe, both struck down with an axe in their grocery store residence. Lowe survived long enough to give police a description of her attacker, but died before providing details that might have cracked the case. August saw the killer branch out from Italian grocers when he targeted Edward Schneider's pregnant wife, while Schneider worked a night shift. Anna Schneider survived the attack and even gave birth to her child 2 days later, but her description of the intruder remained frustratingly vague. A tall, dark figure who struck without warning and disappeared into the night. The attacks shared disturbing consistencies that revealed our killer's evolving methodology. Door panels were consistently chiseled or cut rather than broken. Victims' own axes were invariably used as weapons. The killer showed particular interest in Italian families and grocery store owners. Most unsettling of all, the perpetrator seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to vanish without leaving traces that might lead police to his identity. But the Axeman's most chilling characteristic wasn't his violence. It was his apparent enjoyment of the terror he was creating. This wasn't someone killing for money, passion, or revenge. This felt like someone who had discovered that an entire city could be held captive by fear and found the experience intoxicating. Then came the communication that would transform this local terror into something unprecedented in American criminal history. March 13, 1919. The Times-Picayune received correspondence that would change everything about how people understood this case. The letter, supposedly written by the killer himself, stands as one of the most bizarre communications in criminal history. Let me share some of its contents, keeping in mind this is allegedly from someone who had been systematically murdering families for nearly a year. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. Right away, we're dealing with someone who clearly enjoyed theatrics. But the letter gets much more interesting. Now to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. Think about this for a moment. A serial killer was essentially holding the entire city hostage, but offering a bizarrely specific escape clause. Play jazz music on Tuesday night and you'll be safe. Don't play jazz music and risk becoming the next victim. The letter continued with even more theatrical flourishes, signed the Axeman, and including details about future attacks that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the ongoing investigation. Someone was clearly enjoying their role as the city's primary source of terror. Now here's where the story takes a turn that sounds like something out of a fever dream, rather than actual criminal history. What happened next reveals something fascinating about human psychology under extreme stress. Rather than dismiss the letter as the ravings of a lunatic, New Orleans took it seriously. Very seriously. Tuesday, March 19, 1919 became the most musical night in the city's history. Jazz bands performed in virtually every club, restaurant and dance hall. Private homes hired musicians for impromptu concerts. People who couldn't afford bands gathered around radios and phonographs, playing jazz records at maximum volume. The entire city became a massive, coordinated musical performance, all because a killer had demanded it. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe a surreal atmosphere where terror and celebration existed simultaneously. Families danced in their parlors while keeping axes hidden under beds. Musicians played with unusual intensity, knowing that their performance might literally be a matter of life and death. The sound of jazz music echoed from virtually every building in New Orleans that night. And you know what? It worked. No attacks occurred on March 19th. Not one. This creates one of the most intriguing questions in the entire case. Was the Axeman actually deterred by jazz music, or was this always part of his larger psychological game? Was he someone who genuinely loved jazz and saw an opportunity to force an entire city to appreciate his favorite music? Or was this the ultimate power trip, proving he could control not just individual victims, but the behavior of hundreds of thousands of people with a single letter? While the city danced to jazz rhythms that night, police were working frantically behind the scenes to identify their tormentor. The investigation faced obstacles that would challenge even modern law enforcement, let alone 1919 police work. Detective work in this era relied heavily on witness testimony, physical evidence that could be analyzed with basic forensic techniques, and good old-fashioned detective intuition. The Axeman seemed designed to thwart all three approaches. Witnesses consistently described him in vague terms: tall, dark, possibly Italian or foreign-looking. Physical evidence was minimal and often contaminated by the time investigators arrived. The killer's behavior patterns were consistent enough to establish a profile, but not predictable enough to anticipate future attacks. Police pursued several theories with varying degrees of success. The Italian grocery store connection suggested possible mafia involvement, leading to investigations of organized crime activities in the immigrant community. The use of victims' own axes pointed towards someone with local knowledge, possibly someone who had cased targets in advance. The theatrical nature of the letter suggested someone educated and articulate, potentially eliminating transient suspects. But every lead seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. Suspects were questioned and released. Evidence trails went cold. The Axeman remained as mysterious as ever, continuing to strike seemingly at random while maintaining his supernatural ability to avoid detection. Unfortunately for the terrified residents of New Orleans, the jazz ultimatum didn't end the killing spree. It merely added another layer of psychological complexity to an already bizarre case. Additional attacks occurred throughout 1919, each one reinforcing the killer's apparent invincibility while adding new pieces to an increasingly complex puzzle. Steve Bocca, an Italian grocer, was attacked in August 1919 using the now familiar pattern of door panel removal and axe assault. Bocca survived but could provide no useful description of his attacker. Sarah Laumann was less fortunate. The 19-year-old was found dead in her home, killed with her own axe after someone had carefully chiseled through her door. Each attack demonstrated the killer's evolving sophistication. Entry methods became more refined. Target selection showed increasing strategic thinking. The Axeman was learning from experience, adapting his techniques, and becoming more efficient at avoiding detection. But perhaps most unsettling was the growing sense that these attacks were only part of a larger game. The killer seemed to be studying not just his victims, but the city's response to his activities. Each attack generated massive newspaper coverage, police mobilization, and public panic. Someone was clearly enjoying the attention and power that came with holding an entire metropolitan area in fear. As the body count rose and the mystery deepened, theories about the Axeman's identity began proliferating throughout New Orleans and beyond. The mafia theory gained significant traction due to the concentration of Italian victims and the organized nature of the attacks. Italian grocers were often involved in complex financial relationships within immigrant communities, creating potential motives for systematic elimination. However, traditional mafia killings rarely involved the theatrical elements that characterized Axeman attacks. Professional criminals typically sought to minimize attention, while the Axeman seemed to crave publicity. The mental illness theory suggested someone suffering from severe psychological disorders that manifested in violent behavior towards specific ethnic groups. However, the sophisticated planning and execution of attacks suggested someone capable of complex reasoning and long-term strategy, traits that seemed inconsistent with severe mental illness as understood in 1919. The supernatural theory, while obviously appealing to newspaper readers, reflected the genuine bewilderment that investigators felt when confronted with the killer's apparent ability to strike without leaving useful evidence. In an era before modern forensic science, someone who could consistently avoid detection might genuinely seem to possess otherworldly abilities. The copycat theory suggested multiple killers using the Axeman name to cover their individual crimes. However, the consistent use of victims' own axes and the methodical door panel removal suggested a single perpetrator with a very specific methodology. Each theory contained elements of truth, while failing to provide a complete explanation for the Axeman's behavior. But as 1919 progressed toward its conclusion, something unexpected began to happen. Axeman attacks became less frequent but no less terrifying. The final confirmed Axeman attack occurred on October 27, 1919. Mike Pepitone, another Italian grocer, was killed in his home using the familiar pattern of door panel removal and axe assault. His wife discovered the body and provided police with their clearest description yet of the killer, a tall, dark man who had fled through the back of the house after completing his gruesome work. But even this apparently final attack contained mysteries that investigators couldn't resolve. Then, as suddenly as the terror had begun, it ended. No more door panels were chiseled. No more families were attacked with their own axes. The Axeman of New Orleans simply vanished from the criminal landscape, leaving behind only questions, theories, and the lingering fear that he might return at any moment. Some investigators theorized that the killer had been Mike Pepitone's final victim, that the grocer had somehow managed to wound or kill his attacker before succumbing to his own injuries. Others suggested the killer had moved to different cities and continued his activities under different methods. The most unsettling possibility was that the Axeman had simply chosen to stop killing, either because he had achieved whatever psychological satisfaction he sought, or because he had developed other outlets for his violent impulses. However, there's one more twist to this already twisted tale that adds yet another layer of mystery to the entire affair. 6 months after Mike Pepitone's murder, his widow received an unexpected visitor. In December 1919, Mrs. Pepitone traveled to Los Angeles, where she encountered a man she claimed was her husband's killer. According to newspaper reports, she shot and killed Joseph Mumphrey, insisting he was the Axeman who had terrorized New Orleans. Mumphrey had indeed been in New Orleans during the attack period, had been released from prison shortly before the killings began, and had left the city around the time they ended. He also had connections to the Italian community and knowledge of grocery store operations that might have helped him select victims. But was Mumphrey really the Axeman? Mrs. Pepitone's identification occurred under traumatic circumstances and couldn't be verified by other witnesses. Mumphrey never confessed to the crimes, and no physical evidence linked him to the attacks. The connection remained purely circumstantial, leaving investigators with yet another theory that explained some aspects of the case while failing to provide definitive answers. If Mumphrey was the Axeman, it would explain the abrupt end of the attacks and provide a satisfying conclusion to the mystery. If he wasn't, then Mrs. Pepitone had killed an innocent man, while the real Axeman remained free to continue his activities elsewhere. Nearly a century after the last confirmed attack, we're left with one of America's most compelling unsolved criminal cases. Modern forensic techniques that might have identified the killer were unavailable to 1919 investigators. DNA analysis, fingerprint databases, behavioral profiling, and crime scene reconstruction methods that could have cracked the case simply didn't exist. Contemporary true crime investigators have applied modern analytical techniques to surviving evidence, but time has degraded most physical materials beyond usefulness. Police reports from the era provide detailed information about individual attacks, but lack the comprehensive data collection that might have revealed patterns invisible to period investigators. The case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations, each attempting to solve the mystery through different analytical approaches. Some focus on historical research, seeking to identify potential suspects through archival investigation. Others apply modern psychological profiling to create detailed portraits of the killer's likely characteristics and motivations. But despite decades of renewed investigation, the Axeman's identity remains as mysterious as ever. Someone terrorized an entire city, controlled public behavior through written ultimatums, and vanished without leaving sufficient evidence to reveal their identity. Standing here in 2025, looking back at the Axeman of New Orleans, we're confronted with a case that defies easy categorization. Was this a serial killer who happened to love jazz music? A psychological manipulator who discovered that an entire city could be controlled through fear and theatrical demands? A criminal mastermind who used terror tactics to achieve goals we still don't understand? Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Axeman case isn't the mystery of the killer's identity, but the sheer audacity of what he accomplished. Someone managed to transform an entire metropolitan area into participants in his psychological drama, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to perform jazz music under threat of death. The killer had effectively turned New Orleans into the world's largest, most desperate concert. The case reminds us that some mysteries resist solution, not because evidence is lacking, but because the events themselves were so unusual that conventional analytical approaches prove inadequate. The Axeman operated according to his own logic, following patterns that made sense only to himself, while creating chaos that investigators couldn't decode. Did Joseph Mumfre really die for the Axeman's crimes? Or did the real killer escape justice while watching from the shadows as someone else paid the price? Was the jazz ultimatum genuine musical appreciation, or the ultimate expression of psychological control? Did the attacks really end in 1919, or simply move to other cities where they weren't recognized as connected to the New Orleans terror? These questions may never be answered, but they ensure that the Axeman of New Orleans will continue haunting true crime enthusiasts, investigators, and anyone fascinated by the possibility that sometimes reality can be stranger and more terrifying than any fiction we might imagine. The jazz still plays in New Orleans, floating through humid nights just as it did in 1919. And somewhere in those melodies, the memory of a killer who held an entire city hostage with nothing more than words, an axe, and an inexplicable love for America's most distinctive musical art form continues to echo through the centuries.